Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Chesak. I currently serve as both president and a member of the board of directors of Women's Declaration International USA. And today we will be discussing Vaishnavi Sundar's film Behind the Looking Glass and interviewing one of the women who is featured in it. Vaishnavi Sundar is an Indian filmmaker, radical feminist, writer, and activist who also produced the film Dysphoric. Behind the Looking Glass, her newest film released in August, is a film about the lives of women whose partners have or want to quote unquote transition. While we hear a great deal of stunning and brave stories of men, there is a deadly silence when it comes to the stories of the wives or partners. This film will be the first of its kind in collecting such experiences of women from around the world, and that description is from Lime Soda Films' YouTube channel, who produced the film. Austen encountered a radical feminist analysis while seeking to understand her husband's quote unquote gender dysphoria. Attempting to validate and defend his delusion, she instead found out about the harms of sex stereotypes, male violence, and body dissociation. She now openly opposes gender identity ideology, volunteers for WDI advocating for women's sex-based rights, and shares her story to help other women. Thank you so much for joining us today, Austen. It's great to have you.
Yay, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yep, happy to. So, if we could just jump right in, if you wouldn't mind defining what a trans widow is and telling us a bit about your experience as one.
I was married to someone who had the delusion that he, was in the wrong body. And my story is very different from most trans widows. I think most trans widows are already married, to a husband and everything's going, like normally, and then their husband transitions. That was not the case with me. I married this man knowing that he was, he didn't tell me that. Yeah, he did tell me that he was trans. He went to a therapist, and the therapist told him that this was totally normal. The reason you like to dress this way, and the reason you have this other side of your personality is because you're trans. And so I was asked to accept it and support it, and which I did. It was 2011 or 12 at the time. And this is before Caitlyn Jenner. This is before any this was being discussed in the mainstream at all. And so I didn't know about it. I didn't really think it very deeply. I was like, okay, that's weird. It's probably another one of his phases, and he's gonna get over it, and I'm just gonna go ride the wave. And so I didn't really care. I liked that he wasn't masculine. I liked that he, was comfortable enough with himself to dress in these ways that made people look at him funny. I didn't care about any of that. It's not my issue. And so we were married, and we were married for several years. He started taking the hormones right around the time that we got engaged, and then he just kept taking them, and I thought that he was going to get over it, and he never did. He just never got over it. And then his body was changing, his brain was changing. He was becoming more and more difficult to live with. And at first it seemed good. It seemed like a good change. At first he was going, he was becoming more sensitive and a little bit more cuddly. It was like he sort of was falling into this nurturing sort of way that he perceived women to be. And then so yeah, that's way different about my story. And I think that's why in the film, I'm not in the film very much, just little snippets of my interviews are in there from time to time, because my story didn't really fit with the others. It's really different. We were really, really happily married. We were ecstatically married for a very long time. And then it did shift when did you ask me about how I got into the film? Or
Not
did
yet,
you
no.
just ask
Yeah,
me
let's
to
just
tell
jump
you
right
what a
in.
trans? Yeah, so trans widow can be like anything from someone who is married to a husband who she thinks everything's normal, she has children with him, and then he decides he's a woman all of a sudden, usually porn induced. And that is, and all the way to like my side of the spectrum of that, where, you know, this man kind of always had the tendency to be somewhat effeminate, and then kind of like just sort of inched more and more toward that. And then, yeah, when I discovered radical feminism, basically I stopped going along with it. And that's when things kind of got weird.
And how did you discover radical feminism?
So my favorite author is Derek Jensen. I love everything he ever wrote. I've followed his Facebook page for many, many years before I ever even knew my ex. And he made a post one time that mentioned trans, saying that something about how it affected women. And I I questioned it. You know, we had rapport. We had talked a couple of times in, you know, direct messages and stuff. Just, you know, I was letting him know that I was a fan and that I lived kind of close by him. And then we started talking about this, and he handed me over to the radical feminists. He's mentioned a couple of them in the post and was like, "Hey, do you guys want to, you know, help her understand?" And they did. They really helped me understand. It took me a while for it to kick in, but then yeah, I got it. It was like, "Oh, this is blackface, but for women." And I didn't understand that women were an oppressed class of people. I just didn't understand. That was the missing piece for me. And I think that's the missing piece for a lot of people um, in in the world today. People don't understand that women are treated differently and are socialized differently, and are oppressed on the basis of sex, not on any other basis. It's because we're women. And so that piece was missing. I started to get it. It started to click. I became closer with Derek and his wonderful partner, Lier. We, you know, we just kind of all started talking, and then it like I got into radical feminist circles online, and I started volunteering with WDI, and it just sort of like the ball kept rolling in that direction. And I kept trying to go to him and say, "You need to rethink this. It's not okay what this movement is doing to women. It's not okay what you're doing to your body." And you know, the health aspect of it always really did ruin it for me. The health aspect of what he was doing to his body was always very uncomfortable for me. At first, he said he was going to take hormones. I said, "No, I'm out. It's not okay with me," because I've always been about my health. I've always been about the health of my loved ones. He started taking them, he started sneaking them, and I could tell. I was like, "What is going on with your body? This is so weird." And then, you know, he sort of like spilled his guts about it. And then he, you know, was acting suicidal and acting like, you know, it was the only way. And so I was like, "Okay, whatever." So I went along with it for a while. And then, you know, I started following Excellentic, and then I started realizing that, you know, this stuff was doing really awful, irreversible, permanent, horrible damage. And I could see that it was affecting his brain as well. And so 7 years later, after he had been taking them, I was finally like, "Dude, I gotta draw the line. This is just out of control." And so yeah, that's how I found the feminists, and it was through Derek Jensen. And we did
Wow.
end up becoming, yeah, personal friends, and now we see each other. We often see each other around the holidays, and Lier always, of course. And uh yeah, they come through sometimes when they're around my area. And so it's actually a really a much better trade-off to have real you know, like life-loving people in my world. I'm really glad I made that switch from having somebody who was totally artificial and who was totally bringing me into his delusions. And now I have actual real friends who are, you know, they're doing something real with their lives.
Mhm. Wow. Wow. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Real friends and grounded in reality.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What was it like to participate in the creation of Behind the Looking Glass, and what does the film mean to you?
The film means a ton. It's so, so important to switch the narrative from being all about the men and what they're doing to themselves to the women that nobody ever thinks about. Um, I didn't have a lot of involvement with the film. It was like two online interviews that I did with her. And and there, I'm, like I said, I'm not in the film very much, that's just because my story was so wildly different, I think. And I was in a really happy marriage. The film was portraying the dark side of all of this. And like as you can see, I'm really happy. I was happy the whole time. I never, and I also wasn't talking about a lot of it because at the time of those interviews, I was still friends with my ex, and I didn't want to do anything to compromise our friendship. I've really kind of come through that phase, and I don't really care anymore, how he feels about how I tell my story. Um, but yeah, at the time I was being really careful not to, reveal anything in the film that might make him victimize himself, come to me and say, oh, you did this to me, and now that's my personal whatever. Like, this is my story. I'm going to tell it now. At the time, I didn't really feel like that. So, I wasn't willing to talk about family, and I wasn't really willing to talk about sexuality and all of that stuff. So,
Yeah. I did notice, so similar to Dysphoric, Behind the Looking Glass is both animation and video interviews. And Vaishnavi has very cleverly and creatively animated many of the women so that they can be anonymous. If that was important to them, for one reason or another, maybe family, maybe they had kids and whatnot. And you were not animated. You appeared as video interviews. And so I'm curious how you made that decision to waive your anonymity.
yeah, it was a little bit of a decision. I had to think about it. And the reason that the women, I'll tell you the reason why they were animated is because these men are abusers.
Mhm.
They're they're it's just the same as any other abusive man. You don't want to rile them. You don't want to poke these bears. They're just as abusive. It's just a different type of abuse. And and so like I said, my ex wasn't physically abusive. I was never scared of him. Not for one second was I ever scared of him. He never, like, he never did anything that made me feel like I needed to suppress myself, or that I was always able to be myself and conduct myself as usual in the relationship. So yeah, I don't care anymore. I'm alone anyway. I don't really have, a lot of people around me. Just my daughter and her friends are my family. They're the people who are closest to me. They're the ones who come through my house and have meals with me and stuff like that. So yeah, he's gone completely now. His toxic energy is removed, and I can feel the difference. And yeah, everyone I know who has removed him from their lives feels a palpable relief from not having him in their lives anymore. Most especially me and my daughter.
Yeah, I bet. So waiving the anonymity was part of you saying, this is my story and I'm going to tell it?
Yeah, I'm yeah, I wasn't really ready to tell it as openly as I am now, but I did decide that it would be okay for me to use my real name and my real face and not be scared. I didn't have any reason to really be scared.
Yeah. What do others often get wrong about trans widows?
Nobody thinks about trans widows. Nobody knows trans widows even exist. Nobody knows what you know, and that's similar, I think, to any woman who's in a situation of abuse, a victim of abuse by a man. I think that the man controls the narrative, and I think the woman is kind of like just in the shadows, forgotten. She doesn't want to talk about it because it's embarrassing, number one, and she's in the habit of protecting her partner. Needs she needs to basically let things be along the lines of his narrative, or she's going to get asked unanswerable questions. And like, people think we could just leave if we wanted to. Anyone who's being abused by a man knows that you can't just leave if you want to. There's a lot of complex, I mean, besides the sentimental attachment you have to the person, which is very, very strong for women, is extremely strong for women. We feel about our men similar to the way we feel about our babies. We take care of them, and we want to protect them. And even when they're wrong, we're waiting for them to come around and discover that they're wrong. You know, we're just and so I feel like we're kind of stuck. And then it's just kind of like everybody has this attitude, well, you could leave, you know, and it's just not like that. So it's a big misunderstanding. Yeah, that's about it. I think no one thinks about trans widows. No one recognizes the plight
Mhm.
until someone like Vaishnavi comes along and makes our plight the center of um the show.
Mhm. Mhm. And she was the first. I mean, to my knowledge, there aren't any other documentaries about trans widows, even though it's a number that's growing every day.
I haven't seen anything. I know there are a couple of websites where you
Mhm.
can read the stories. And even though my story was so different from the others, I definitely saw myself in those stories. And I think that any woman who's in a situation of abuse with a man, even if she doesn't think of it as abusive, is going to see herself in these stories too. It is just abuse. It's just male violence against women in a very tricky undercurrent kind of way, but it's patriarchy. It's still patriarchy. It's still patriarchy. It's just in drag. So it's kind
Mhm.
of unrecognizable. At first, you're just like, what is this?
Yep. Yep. How can trans widows contribute to the women's liberation movement, including the dismantling of gender identity ideology and of old gender, meaning sex stereotypes?
Well, we need to tell our stories, and we don't like telling our stories because it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing that we fell for it and that it took so much of our lives. It took, drained us of our resources and our energy. And we tried so hard we waited so long for these men to come around and get through whatever, mental thing they were going through. And so we need to tell our stories. It's difficult and you feel kind of stupid at first, but then it gets easier as you tell it. You, the words start to come easier because you're used to saying it and you've heard yourself say it out loud. And now it's like, okay, this is my story. You accept it yourself, and then you can heal. Once you're talking about it, you can heal. And that it really does help other women to heal. And just like detransitioners, once we're telling our stories, and there are a number of us, then really it starts to get into like the normal people start hearing about it, and then we can advocate for ourselves and we can start to make change on a bigger scale. Sex stereotypes are so pervasive, it's ridiculous, and I'm actually really worried that we're going to lose the progress we had made dismantling sex stereotypes in the first place, as feminists. I really, really worry about that we have now a situation where people are so annoyed with the trans movement that there's like a backlash forming now against all of it. And I think that this is even dragging in gay and lesbian people, and the progress that they've made. Now that the trans movement is part of that, it's been glommed onto that movement. Now I think that people who are neither, people who are comfortable with their stereotypes are like looking at it like, this is all stupid. Forget the whole thing. I feel like the pendulum is going to swing really hard the other way and unfortunately undo a lot of the progress that had been made, by the 90s and early 2000s. So it was pretty much comfortable. Now, if anybody sees anybody dressed outside of stereotypes, they pretty much associate them with that movement, which is really ugly. And nobody wants any part of it. Anybody who normal doesn't want any part of it. So I would definitely worry about that. Dismantling sex stereotypes still needs to happen. We still, especially for women, I mean, women are harmed by our stereotypes, unlike men. So that still needs to happen. We need to just not let go of that thread and make sure that we don't, just say, oh, the whole thing is is stupid, so let's just be housewives, or whatever. I don't know. I worry about that. People look now, and if they see someone who's drastically outside stereotypes, they think, oh, that person's mentally ill. They're one of those trans. It's like, there are very few people left who are strongly sympathizing, I think, with the trans. And
Mhm. How can the women's liberation movement support trans widows?
just what you're doing right now, is sharing our stories, really, really is amazing. And like I said, there aren't very many. I don't think there are a lot of trans widows. I don't think there are as many trans widows as there are detransitioners. So we're not like I don't feel like we're like a big group of people who's being massively ignored. I just think that we're a little bit fringe, and what you're doing is really, really helpful, just sharing the story, letting people know that we do exist, and that it is harmful to us. What has happened to us is harmful. And WDI USA has been really, really important, I think, in this country, because it injects a feminist argument into court cases and legal proceedings that are ignoring this part. It's really dangerous for us to win this movement without interjecting those feminist arguments. Partly because of what we just talked about sex stereotypes, and lesbians being protected for not being seen as mentally ill just because they don't wear stereotypical female clothes, but also for the reason that um because women's rights. I mean, it seems so complicated, and it's so simple. The fact that women's rights really need to be a part of this conversation. Um, the work of WDI USA, I was always really, really proud to be associated with them, because they would file an amicus brief in a case where basically it was like, it was being argued that just women's sports or just medical scandal, these parts of the issue they're important. It's important that we win those cases, and we do still win, but we don't win completely as women until we make sure that it is underlined and acknowledged that this is a woman-hating movement. This is the opposite of feminism. And a lot of people have that so wrong. So I think that what your organization is doing is so important. And I don't ever want you to stop doing that. Legally, it's really, really important. We need a legal definition of sex. We need to establish, thoroughly and profoundly, that women are biological females, not like whatever they're being defined as right now. And once we have that definition, we need to get to work on ratifying the ERA. Once we actually know what a woman is, we need to make sure we have constitutional rights as women, so this can never happen again. Because I'm really afraid that if we just win on the medical scandal front, or we just win on the women's sports front, we're not going to win completely, and we're going to have to fight again and again and again until we do.
And I think our leftist radical feminist critique is a really important part of modulating the impending pendulum swing, because we're reminding people that there is a feminist critique, and that breaking sex stereotypes is good, but the way to do that isn't to say, well, I identify as something that I'm not, and I'm going to demand that everyone else pay for my hormones and surgeries. Like, that's not how to go about it. But breaking sex stereotypes is something that we stand for.
Yeah. And gay and lesbian people, rights for gay and lesbian people. I mean, we don't want to lose that with the bathwater.
Yeah.
It's just so important, because we are leftists. I mean, like, I don't know, we're lost politically right now, because the left is completely off the rails. It's gone into a really weird place. I don't even know if anyone's going there with them. I'm starting to look at it, and it seems like everybody rational is I don't It's weird because we got called right wing for so long.
Mhm.
We got called right wing extremists, and I'm like, I'm definitely not right wing. I want gay and lesbian rights. I want women to be able to get abortions. I want, people to be able to dress however, they as long as it's like appropriate for the public. I want people to be able to dress however they feel.
What advice do you have for women who discover that their husband or boyfriend has the fetish of autogynephilia?
I think that if a woman is in a relationship with a man and he has an abnormal sexual fetish of any kind, she needs to get away from him as fast and as safely as she possibly can and take the kids. I think sexual fetishes in men are really dangerous, and I don't think it's about you anymore. Once you know he has a fetish, it's not about you. This is the experiment that you have to do. If you're in a relationship with a man, you find out he has a fetish. If you think he really loves you and you think that it's not about the fetish, it's about you, just see what happens if you stop participating in the fetish. Just see what happens if you stop. If you just say, not really into it, I'm not going to do that anymore. It just, doesn't really do it for me. Like, just see what happens. And, if he is totally okay with that and doesn't look for it somewhere else and doesn't, make you feel alienated or isolated or even abused for not participating in it, then I would be really, really impressed. And if a man has a fetish, I promise you that's all he is driven by. That is what he is driven by, is what drives him sexually. And um it's just dangerous to you to be in that position of carrying that for him and being that for him. So get away from any man you find out has a fetish. But I think autogynephilia is especially dangerous because it's woman hating. It is absolutely a woman hating thing. And if you can't see it, maybe it's because you're too close to it. I mean, as soon as you're away from it, you can see that what he's doing is is blackface. And you're the brunt of it. You're the what would you say? You're being parodied. You're being made fun of.
If he's making himself up and he's taking pictures of himself in the mirror, and meanwhile you're trying to get dinner on the table and you're trying to get the kids to school, and like all the things that stereotypically fall to women, he's calling himself a woman, but he doesn't want to participate in any of the tasks that fall to you.
No, he makes more work for you all the time. It's crazy. If you're an actual woman and you're doing the actual work that most women just do around the house because they want to live in a nice space and they want the kids to grow up in a nice space and they want an atmosphere, like, you're constantly cleaning up a snail trail of his weird items that are just trailing behind him. It's like, I'm telling you, I'm coming from personal experience. This is one of my biggest frustrations about living with him. Was he first thing, I would wake up every morning to the clacking of his makeup containers. He was clackling and makeup brushes, and just is this process every single morning of my entire life. I had to like wake up to that, and it was like, oh, he's clacking those makeup containers and popping his pills. I could hear his pill containers, and he's taking his artificial hormones and putting on his artificial face and his artificial clothes to try to make this presentation of himself. And that was just a way, every day. And then I go in, and of course he doesn't clean up any of the stuff. It's all just like everywhere. There's like powder makeup everywhere. There's his trail, there's like stockings and like just stuff laying around all over the house all the time. Oh, I don't think this is even unique. I don't even think that I'm unique as a woman. I think that this is what women do. We take care of them. We carry them as far as we possibly can, and then we're like, I gotta put you down. Like, I'm too old for this shit.
I
You
want to,
know?
yeah, I want to go back to the topic of fetishes, because we know that fetishes cluster, especially in men. And so what you said about, if you're with a husband or a boyfriend who has a fetish, any kind of sexual fetish, if he has the fetish of thinking that he's a woman and getting off on how humiliating he perceives that to be, he probably has other fetishes too.
Fetish is a slippery slope. It leads to other things, and usually people with fetishes are into porn, which leads to unthinkable atrocities against
Mhm.
women and children. So
Well, before we wrap up, is there anything else that you feel our audience should know?
checks notes.
Yep.
Let me see if there's anything I forgot to say. I wrote a whole bunch of stuff down for this, and then I will say that like we're all much happier now that he's not in our lives, and it took me a really long time to get there. Even after we separated years ago, and then it was only a few months ago that I was at the acceptance stage of grief. I went through so much just extreme depression, about losing that love and losing the dream and losing, the family, the connection. I really loved him, and we spent so many years having so much fun together, and we were just like a really good couple. It was really just like a lot of fun. And so that was just really hard for me to accept, that it had been artificial, that I had been like, that I had wasted so much of my time and energy and resources. And, now I'm kind of like just like I'm starting at ground zero again. Like, because like now I'm in my 40s, I feel like I'm not gonna have that kind of, I'm not gonna have that fun young love again, So it's really worth getting away as soon as you can.